when an arrogant white female cop, believing herself above the law, disrespects a renowned black judge known for his fairness. The courtroom holds its breath. No one expected his powerful ruling to not only shatter her arrogance, but also change her life forever. Los Angeles County Courthouse. Monday morning sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, illuminating the bustling hallways. The air inside the courthouse was heavy, partly from the constant murmur of whispered conversations, and partly from the presence of a figure who was no stranger to controversy. Officer Rachel Monroe. Rachel, a white female police officer, was well known not just for her competence, but also for her arrogance. She had dodged trouble numerous times, hiding behind her badge. But this time, things were different. She was charged with reckless driving, running a red light, and nearly hitting an elderly pedestrian, Thomas Green. The incident had not only injured Mr. Green, but also raised serious questions about Rachel's ethics and professional conduct. The case quickly became the talk of the town, especially since it would be presided over by Judge Henry Foster, a black man celebrated for his fairness and strict adherence to the principle that everyone is equal before the law. Inside the courtroom, the seats quickly filled. Journalists, lawyers, and onlookers sat in silence, their eyes brimming with curiosity as they awaited Rachel's arrival. Some hoped she would finally face the consequences of her actions, while others doubted whether her privilege would allow her to escape punishment once again. As the room grew thick with tension, the door creaked open. Rachel entered, her neatly pressed police uniform catching the light. She carried herself with the demeanor of someone used to being the center of attention, head held high, her cold gaze sweeping across the room as if no one present was worthy of her notice. Her blonde hair was tightly tied back, her face meticulously made up, and the sound of her polished shoes echoed sharply on the marble floor. Behind her, her attorney hurried to keep up, his face tight with stress. He leaned toward her, whispering, "Rachel, remember to act professional. This is not the time to show off." Rachel merely smirked, a faint, mocking smile. She didn't reply or slow her stride. When she reached the defendant's table, she sat with icy confidence, placing her bag on the polished wooden surface before crossing her arms. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as all eyes focused on her. Moments later, a side door opened, and Judge Foster entered, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, neatly trimmed and sharp eyes framed by metal-rimmed glasses. He exuded an air of authority. Despite the courtroom's tension, he moved with calm precision, embodying the weight of justice itself. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out. Everyone stood at attention, everyone except Rachel, who rose reluctantly, letting out an audible sigh. Her defiance didn't escape Judge Foster's notice, though he chose not to address it. Instead, he gave a slight nod to the bailiff before sitting at the bench, opening the case file, and preparing to commence the trial. His sharp gaze briefly landed on Rachel, as if measuring the person who now stood before the scales of justice. In that fleeting moment, the room's atmosphere grew heavier, as though everyone could sense this would not be a typical courtroom proceeding. Rachel, despite maintaining her outward confidence, couldn't shake an underlying sense of unease. Yet instead of reflecting, she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her gaze indifferent as it rested on the judge. To her, this was just another tedious formality, a routine script she'd seen play out many times before and expected to navigate easily once again. What she didn't know was that today would be unlike any other day. Today, justice would prevail. Rachel sat in the defendant's chair, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if forming a shield against the scrutiny of the entire courtroom. Her sigh echoed loudly, clearly intentional, ensuring everyone heard it. In front of her was a dark wooden table, soon to bear the weight of her alleged crimes. Yet Rachel didn't look at it. Instead, her gaze lazily wandered across the room, as if searching for something more interesting to occupy her attention. Outwardly, she wore the uniform of a police officer, a symbol of authority and duty, but her posture and attitude sent an entirely different message: defiance. Her meticulously manicured nails tapped rhythmically on the wooden surface, producing soft but provocative clicks that filled the tense silence. From the gallery, the attendees couldn't conceal their unease. A few whispered to one another, their eyes fixed on Rachel, as if trying to pierce through her facade of arrogance. A middle-aged woman leaned toward the person beside her, speaking in a hushed tone. "She doesn't look like someone about to be judged. It's like she's treating this as her own press conference." Rachel heard it but didn't care. A faint smirk played on her lips, as though the whispered comment only bolstered her confidence. By now, Judge Foster had settled into his seat. He cast a brief but piercing glance at Rachel, his gaze sharp enough to cut through her layers of defense. But Rachel didn't return the look. Instead, she adjusted her hair, a deliberate act of provocation, as if to signal her indifference. When the guard's firm voice rang out, "All rise," the courtroom collectively stood, from the spectators to the legal teams. But Rachel remained seated, her eyes fixed straight ahead, arms still crossed, chin tilted upward in defiance. The sound of shuffling feet and the respectful silence of the room only served to highlight her blatant disregard. Rachel's lawyer, standing beside her, bent down and whispered urgently, "Rachel, stand up. This isn't a joke." She turned to him, her icy blue eyes locking onto his before letting out a dry laugh. "They won't do anything to me. We both know that." Her words weren't loud, but they were audible enough for those nearby to hear. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Some frowned. Others exchanged uneasy glances. As the courtroom fell still again, Rachel remained motionless. Only when Judge Foster spoke, his voice deep and commanding, did she finally stir. "Ms. Monroe, in my courtroom, everyone follows the rules. Stand up immediately." For a brief moment, Rachel hesitated, but rather than rising promptly, she pushed her chair back slowly, standing with an air of reluctant compliance. Her hands rested on her hips, her lips curling into a mocking smile. The sharp clicks of her high heels echoed as she adjusted her stance, clearly designed to draw attention. Now standing, she slouched lazily, her body language screaming that her compliance was purely begrudging. Judge Foster, his face passive, maintained his unwavering gaze on her, silently delivering a message. "I see exactly who you are." The tension in the room grew heavy. Everyone could feel the undercurrent of conflict brewing between the two figures at the center of it all, an uncompromising judge and a police officer accustomed to privilege. The battle had already begun, requiring no raised voices or dramatic gestures. As the trial commenced, Judge Foster's voice carried the weight of authority. "Ms. Monroe, you stand before this court today accused of reckless driving, running a red light, and nearly causing a pedestrian accident that resulted in Mr. Green's injury. Do you wish to contest these charges?" Rachel leaned back in her chair, adjusting the collar of her uniform slowly. At the mention of Mr. Green's name, she raised an eyebrow, then smirked dismissively. "No need. I just hit the gas a little. Who doesn't? Why make such a big deal out of it?" Her words sent a ripple through the room. Whispers of disapproval spread. A few shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged glances of outrage. Rachel's lawyer seated beside her flushed red, tugging at her sleeve urgently. "Rachel, stop. This isn't the time for jokes." But Rachel ignored him, her cold gaze fixed on Judge Foster. Judge Foster set his pen down deliberately, raising his eyes to meet hers. His face revealed no obvious emotion, but the gravity in his stare silenced the room instantly. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his voice firm, "are you aware of the consequences of your actions?" Rachel laughed dryly, the sound echoing uncomfortably in the stillness. She shrugged, her tone dripping with disdain. "The guy's fine. Don't blow it out of proportion. I don't see why we're all here over something so trivial." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Foster's piercing gaze locked onto Rachel. The next few hours would challenge not only her arrogance, but also the very foundation of justice she had taken for granted.